In January, my husband and our daughter both died in a car crash. They hit a tree at 70 miles per hour and died instantly on impact. My son, Aiden, took it the hardest. Harder than me. He had been in the back seat of the car and had barely escaped death. But he did lose an arm. His right arm was taken off by a branch, and he was lucky he didn't also die in that crash. Now it's just me and him. First, it was just a change in behavior. He acted odd, didn't talk much, and avoided coming down for dinner every now and again. He was still eating here and there, but he missed his dad and sister. Aiden was a daddy's boy, you could say, so I was patient with him for a while. Then he stopped eating completely, and whenever I approached him about it, he snapped and stormed off. Like I said, I understood. I had to be patient because I felt awful too, but I just didn't want Aiden to starve himself. It had gotten to the point where he was having violent stomach aches. I rushed him to the doctors. "You have to eat something, Aiden." I turned to him on the way home, and he silently nodded at me. When we pulled into the driveway, he rushed out of the car and up to his room. 1 month passed, not one meal. 2, 3, 4, 5. It just went on, and every time I asked, he just responded with something along the lines of, "I'm not hungry, don't worry, Mom." So I didn't. I let him be. I knew he was eating something because he couldn't survive on nothing for 5 months. But maybe he just wasn't comfortable eating at home. Eventually, I became sick of it. As a mother, I couldn't just let my son starve himself. It was now almost July, and the accident was in January, and even I had started to return to some sort of normality, so I took it upon myself to cook something for him. A nice, juicy steak with a side of French fries, and as I prepared the steak, the meat fell off the bone gently, hitting the tray it sizzled in. Knock, knock, knock. I knocked before pushing Aiden's door open, turning on the light. "I cooked you some—" I stopped, frowning. Aiden had something in his mouth which he was chewing like his life depended on it, and so I set the plate down on his drawers. "Aiden?" I stepped into his room as he swallowed whatever he was eating. "Nothing, just the Snickers from the fridge." Aiden seemed nervous and sort of ushered me out of the room. I accepted it and left the plate in there, standing silently as he closed the door behind me. The following day, something compelled me to look inside the fridge, and when I did, I regretted it. I had taken comfort in knowing Aiden was eating something, at least, but it turns out that the multi-pack of Snickers I'd bought wasn't even opened. So what the hell had he been eating? Something compelled me to find out, so my first course of action was to install a camera just outside of his room to see if I could catch him leaving the room to get food. A little pathetic, but I worry. Mothers do. I slept well that night, knowing that come morning, I'd know. And I did. The camera picked up movement just after 4 a.m., and my son left his room to go downstairs. And around 30 minutes or so later, it picked up movement again, of him going back to his room with a small plate of meat. Perhaps it was the steak, but I had left that in his room. It was strange because he didn't leave his room after that. "Aiden? You awake, sweetie?" I knocked on his door. No answer. So I let myself in to see him sleeping silently, and I smiled a little, only to see the steak I'd cooked completely untouched on his drawers. I picked it up and left, going back downstairs. Just where was he getting the food from? I know that you may be thinking this is no big deal, but I just wanted to know. Because it wasn't from the fridge or anything of the sort, but it was on the plates from downstairs. And then I decided I'd catch him in the act. Again, pathetic, but I was seriously worried at this point. At 4 a.m. I heard movement, so I followed him downstairs quietly and out into the garden. In the dark, I saw a figure. It stood with one arm holding what appeared to be a shovel and the other arm missing. I stepped out into the backyard, causing the sensor to turn on and a dim light to illuminate the garden. The figure turned, revealing my son's face, mouth dripping with drool and standing in front of a small hole in the dirt. I stumbled backwards and fell to the ground, covering my mouth and muffling my screams. Oh, have I forgot to mention my husband and daughter were buried in the backyard? Our town has been plagued by chaos. Worst of all, the killer will call 911 and let us dispatchers hear what happens as he takes the life from his victims. When we arrive, it's always too late. No survivors, and no evidence to suggest who it might be. My sister told me that at her church, attendance has gone up since 19 people have been killed. She's been a church worker herself for almost 33 years.
I ain't sure whether to thank the Lord or the devil, she joked. I told her not to worry, and that the police were on top of things, but honestly, I knew better. Everyone was scrambling, and no one was safe. Things got worse before they got better, because the killer became more attached to the idea of a servant of God. This led to what I was sure was their first big mistake when they decided to let us hear their voice. "What would you like us to call you?" I asked. "Azrael, the keeper of the abyss," the caller responded. It sounded like a male voice, probably mid-20s. "It is time to reap more souls. But first, I think that we need to hear a confession," the voice said. Then I heard another voice. It was a man sobbing. He said he won't hurt me if I tell you what happened," the man said. "Then tell me. As long as you agree that you are bothering to get a confession, will there be absolution?" I asked. I wasn't sure if the killer was considering my words or handling something else. "He says that there will be," the man said as he tried not to cry. "My confession is that I cheated on my wife. I was weak and I needed company, and she was out of town. I knew it was wrong. She found out and she overdosed. I lost my best friend, all because I was a stupid pervert," the man admitted. "You see, you feel better now that you confessed," the killer said. Then they hung up. I held my breath for a minute and then called the man back. He's gone. He didn't... Oh my God, he didn't kill me." I didn't want to tell him that it might have just been luck that got him, or maybe the killer had changed his MO. The killer called back the next day, this time with a woman confessing that she hated her kids and didn't want them. "I just get so tired of providing for them all the time. I have no idea why. I know I'm their mom and I just need to be responsible, but sometimes I just want to give up." The Reaper decided she deserved to die for that attitude. This pattern repeated over the next few days. He would apparently let anyone who was genuinely repentant in his eyes live. We tried to get word out to everyone in town. "I know this sounds crazy, but if you have secrets and you aren't telling your loved ones, now is the time. It might save your life." Over the next few weeks, just like my sister had said before church attendance went up, people were trying their hardest to live good lives. "You know, this Reaper must be associated with the churches in this area, don't you think? After all, they seem to be aware of the private confessions. Should we look into the pastoral offices?" my supervisor suggested. We decided to be discreet and check them out without alerting the clergy. A few of them, we noticed, had prayer boxes, and I arranged to get one open where we found a few old letters stuffed. There were confessions in there as well, and it occurred to me this might be where the killer was able to locate his victims. I saw a few of them were torn open. I told my boss, and they agreed they would monitor that location when the killer called back. They sounded different from before, agitated. "You think you can stop God's will?" they asked. My ears were burning because I realized that they had been watching me from the church. "You must be worried we're getting close to catching you." "You must be confused if you think by locking me away that this will stop. It will never stop as long as people are sinning. And I can prove it to you. I will turn myself in." To my surprise, we were then greeted by a 6-foot-tall white man at our dispatch office. Tracy, my boss, got him to a holding cell. His name was Max, and he claimed responsibility for a few of the kills, but he also said there would be more. "This town is drowning in sin. The purge won't stop unless it's completely wiped away," Max said as we allowed him to speak. We started to get other calls that night. People were reporting that the Reaper was in their neighborhood. "I confessed at church. I was told by our pastor that everything was safe," one older gentleman said. I told my boss I wanted to speak with Max. Getting into the interrogation room, I told him I realized I was wrong about him. "You haven't been doing this alone. You have partners," I said. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said. "So you are saying that you will take the fall for this crime even though the real killers are still out there? Why?" "God has asked me to do this, and I must obey his commands," Max said succinctly. He refused to answer any further questions. He didn't ask for a lawyer either. Over the next week, things got better because of people actually trying to avoid the wrath of the Reaper. It was weird. I had a conversation with my sister about it and asked if God would really approve of this sort of fear. "They ain't sinning, so I guess the devil said he did the job for the good Lord this time," she laughed. "People have died, and your churches haven't done anything to help any of them. We can't help that we are sinful. It's going to happen to the best of us," I argued. I wasn't trying to have a theological debate, but it surprised me she didn't seem too concerned. "Either they will realize they need to obey, or the good Lord will do whatever needs to be done. Simple as that, boy," she snapped back. Her words troubled me as I went to confession that evening and told my own pastor how I felt. "These reapers are ruling by fear. They claim to be doing it all for God, but I don't see how that's possible. I hate God if this is how he operates," I said. That night, as I was lying in bed, someone broke into my house. I heard them come in through the window downstairs, and I reached for a bat under my bed. "I wouldn't do that. It will only make things worse," a voice at the edge of my bed said. A masked woman was standing there holding a gun to me. "We heard your confession, James. It's time for your absolution," she said. "The pastors have been working with you?" I guessed. Then she passed me a bag. I opened it and saw that there were wads of cash inside, and a sick feeling overwhelmed me. I realized that none of this was about salvation. It wasn't who was repentant or not. All these people wanted was money, and if you couldn't pay, you were dead. "Times are tough for the house of God. Give your unholy belongings to the church, and no harm will come to you," she said, confirming her connection to the church. "I don't have anything," I admitted, and then I made a devil's bargain. "But I do operate the 911 call center most nights. I know where people live and how they work. I know more confessions than the precious pastors you steal from," I said as I sat up. "I can get you what you need from the people that deserve divine punishment," I told the masked woman. She liked that idea and knocked me unconscious before she disappeared. The next night at work, someone said I had a gift for me at my desk. It was another letter from that prayer box. "Dear James, we look forward to working with you and fulfilling God's will. Don't disappoint us." I crumpled the letter up and tried to get to work, but I knew if I wanted to live, I would need to fulfill my end of the bargain. I put my headset on and got the first call. I recognized it as my sister's voice. She was complaining about some kids in her area, and I sighed in frustration. "This line is for emergencies," I told her. "Well, maybe you have a way of contacting those people that handle these things. Angels of God, you know. I know you hear from them from time to time," she said. "You know about the Reapers, don't you?" I asked. "And you're asking me to send them to kill these children?" I shouted. I was sickened by her words. She laughed. "The Reapers are doing God's will. You can't stop it. No one can," she responded. And then I was reminded of my own twisted deal with the Reapers. I sent her address to them, knowing she was one of the wealthiest donors in her church. "Let God's will be done," I wrote in the email, and felt my heart stop as I sent the message. What have I become? I've become my own worst nightmare.
I found myself at home one weekend night. My parents went out of town, and I was returning from a canceled sleepover at my friend's house. The lights were on when I got to the door, and I remember getting a phone call from that same friend shortly thereafter, which would end up being the last normal event of that night. My brother was playing video games in the next room, and I could hear him tapping furiously at the video game while I spoke on the cordless phone. I walked around in the living room and ended the phone call in the kitchen when I remember hearing some sort of high-pitched squeal that came from the house somewhere. I couldn't place where it came from, as it sounded the same in every room I went to investigate. It ended about a minute after it started, and was interrupted by the phone ringing. But the phone wasn't in the kitchen where I left it. It was in the bathroom on the counter, in front of the sink. I answered the phone and there was no one there, so I hung up. It was at that point I heard a dragging sound, like a large heavy object was being dragged in the attic crawl space above me. I followed the sound as it slowly navigated from room to room, and ended up in my parents' bedroom. who at the time still had a waterbed. After the sound made it to the far wall, it stopped and the phone rang again. And this time it was my friend on the other line. I told him what was going on, and he told me to be careful and call the police. After I got off the phone, I laid down on the waterbed. I then heard a knock on the door and answered it quickly, but no one was there. It was at this point I called my brother from his room to check something out. I stormed into his room, and there's nobody there. His bed was made and his room spotless. Neither the console nor the TV was on, and the controller was wrapped and unplugged. There's no way he could have hid and cleaned his room in those few seconds it took me to make it to his door of his room. I had been alone the entire night, hearing for 20 minutes straight my brother playing his game that he was not present to be playing. The phone rang again, but again, it was not where I left it. This time it was resting on the kitchen counter, where I originally left it. So I walked through the entire house to answer it. It was my friend calling again, this time saying that the call was dropped for some reason, and he was trying to call me back. I explained to him what just happened, and I heard another knock on the door. Since I was standing right next to it, I peeked through the window within 2 seconds of the knocks, and there was nobody there. At this point I opened the door and stepped out to the porch to make sure I didn't see anyone running away, as I had a large wide open yard, and there's nothing to hide behind. I walked into the front yard and looked around, but couldn't find anything. I found myself engaged in several more minutes of talking to my friend before I got off the line. And it was at that moment where I realized that the place I had been staring at while I was talking were 2 very large black, reflective eyes looking back at me. The figure was tall and lanky, and stood about 10 feet or so from me. The most notable feature he wore was an inhumanly large smile, and he was grinning with oily mechanical teeth from literally ear to ear. Despite me staring directly at him for more than 5 minutes, I pretended that I didn't notice him, and through willpower alone, made it back inside the house without running as fast as I could. Instead, I walked calmly. I remember feeling like if I ran, he would chase me, and somehow knew that he would have caught me easily. I barricaded myself in my room for the rest of the night, but did not fall asleep. The sun came up the next morning and my parents were home. Nothing like that ever happened before, and nothing like that has ever happened since.
Last night, at around 2:30 a.m., I was woken up by a phone call. I assumed it was spam. Maybe my ex-girlfriend calling me to say something stupid, and instinctively reached over to decline the call. My tired brain didn't even bother seeing who it was as I hung it up and went back to sleep. I got another call around 5 minutes later. I groaned and reached to decline it again, but this time I saw who was calling me. 911? Why was 911 calling me? I checked the time. It was 2:35. A call from the police at 2:35? Confused, I answered the call. "Hello?" I asked. I didn't hear anything at first. "Hello?" I asked again. "Hi," a raspy voice replied. This would have been the part where I threw my phone across the bed, but for whatever reason I decided to keep talking. "Who is this?" I said, forgetting for a second that it was obvious. "Didn't the number appear when I called? It's the police, you fucking idiot." I remembered trying to decline the call around this point, but the button didn't work. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself, hearing the person on the other end laugh to himself. "Idiot. You're an idiot," the voice quietly said. Irritated, I asked, "You don't sound like an operator." "Oh, I'm an operator, all right," the voice dryly hissed. "But not one that's willing to kiss your ass anymore." This was confusing. "What are you talking about?" I said, trying to hang up the call again. But it wouldn't even let me power off my phone anymore. I was being forced to listening to some croaky voice spout a bunch of nonsense. The voice seemed to ignore my previous question and kept talking. "I am an operator, and I can do everything an operator can do, and more." The voice chuckled to himself again before he kept going. I'm sorry for messing up your good night's sleep. But you need to know about something. What the fuck? I realized that whoever I was talking to, probably part of the police, and stopped myself at the last second. What should I know about you? There was another pause before the operator began talking again. Before I ask anything, do you remember everyone who called you today? Besides you, nobody called me today. Why do you ask? The operator breathed what sounded like a sigh of relief, but his voice made it hard to hear exactly what it was. Good. That means our plan is still working. You're not the only one who picked up so far, the operator said. Plus, the simple fact that you picked up pretty much forces you to go through with what we have planned. I managed to ask, what do you mean? Before I was interrupted by multiple notifications. I had received 4 or so text messages, all from different numbers. I opened up one of the messages without thinking. It was a house. The image looked like it was taken in the middle of the night. The sky was dark and none of the windows in the house had any light in them. It didn't look like any of the houses in my neighborhood, not even any houses I recognized from anywhere nearby. I opened up the other 3 texts. They all showed a similar image, an image of someone's house, taken in the middle of the night. What is this? I asked. I already said. You aren't the first one who received a call like this. These are all from the past 4 months, the operator replied. His gravelly voice seemed ominously quieter than before. You're looking at dead people's houses. I stayed quiet for a bit before replying. What? You're looking at dead people's houses. All of these people lost the game, so we killed them. You're not serious, are you? The operator laughed again. I hated his laugh. His scratchy, mocking laugh so much. You idiot. Of course we're serious. Do you want to see the bodies? No. No, I don't, I replied. Coward. Fine, you don't doubt that I'm a 911 operator, right? What kind of operator talks about killing people in some game? You're not an operator. You're a maniac. I found myself shouting suddenly. What the fuck do you want from me? Why did you call me? Ugh. Fine. I confess. I may or may not be a 911 operator. There. Are you happy now? Please, leave me alone. Hang up the phone. Don't call back. I'll call the police on you, even if you're already an operator. The operator started cackling, and he kept cackling for way too long. Oh, you idiot! You blind idiot! What police? And that's when he hung up. I struggled to fall back asleep for a bit, especially when I got another text message from one of the phone numbers that was basically a recording of the whole conversation. The message claimed that he said something that gave it away, but after listening to it quite a few times, I still can't find what he's talking about. But I'm scared. From what I've heard, 911 operators can track calls.
How much for Milo? The unsettling man asked. I beg your pardon? I responded. The 5:26 p.m. train home from Manchester is usually brimming with commuters. On this evening, however, it was oddly empty. To ensure I stayed awake and didn't miss our stop, I pressed my face against the ice-cold window beside me. But when a voice disrupted the silent train carriage, I slowly peeled my frozen cheek from the glass pane and twisted to face the frightful figure sitting across the aisle from me. How much for Milo? The man repeated. He was wearing a black trench coat that encased his body from his neck to his feet. He also had an entirely unremarkable face, brown hair and brown eyes. There was nothing particularly frightening about him, and yet everything about him frightened me. He was the only other person in my section of the train, and that realization paralyzed me. Every woman dreads such an encounter. Still, this was not the first time I had felt threatened by a strange man in a public space. I fought hard to swallow the monstrous lump in my throat, and I made an effort to deliver my words confidently. How do you know the name of my child? I asked. The man responded by nodding at my boy's fluffy blue beanie. It had his name stitched across the front, a handmade present from my mum. The explanation seemed rational, so my heart slowed a little, but the man's gaze still filled me with an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Please leave me alone, I said, setting a firm boundary. I gazed down at the small bundle of joy in my lap. Milo was wriggling around with a contented look on his face. I remember thinking that I was ready to die for my boy. I envisioned myself lunging for the man's throat, tearing a chunk out of it with my teeth. I was not going to let any harm come to my baby. I would do anything to protect him. How much would it take? The man gently inquired. I have pepper spray in my pocket, I instantly retorted. He smiled, and it was, without a doubt, the most horrific smile I have ever seen. It was not even particularly malicious or threatening, it was simply wrong. The curvature of his grin was lopsided, and his lips twitched almost imperceptibly for the briefest moment, but I noticed it. It looked as if the man had never smiled before. It was as if he were simply attempting what he had assumed to be a smile. I can see this isn't the right time, he conceded, standing up. I clenched, clutching Milo in my arms. My eyes had not blinked during our entire conversation. I had not dared to close them, even for a millisecond.
The next stop is Mill Hill,
came a voice over the tannoy. This is me, the man declared. I watched and waited. He did not depart the train, but many others did. I did not want to be left alone on a carriage with him. Acting quickly and hugging Milo tightly to my chest, I darted for the doors and followed the crowd of people onto the platform. With bated breath, I watched the man on the train, and he watched me. He did not follow, and when the doors finally closed, I exhaled. I watched the train pull away from the station, almost crying with relief. I still felt my heart pounding furiously against my ribcage, but I did, at the very least, feel I could breathe again. Of course, I now had a much longer walk ahead of me because I'd exited the train 2 stops early. Just a little walk home, Milo, I promised my boy in a half-convincing attempt to conceal my terror. It's good to stretch our legs, eh? The problem is that I had to walk along dark, icy roads. There were plenty of people around at that time, as everybody was coming home from work, so the initial part of the journey was not too overwhelming. I did receive some judgmental looks. People were probably wondering why a lone woman with a baby was walking home in the dark. I didn't blame them. Every ounce of my being wanted to call an Uber or return to the station and wait for a later train, but I stubbornly pressed onwards. I didn't exactly have the spare funds for any additional transport anyway. It was a 2-hour walk on a cold night in December. I told myself that was manageable. Milo was wrapped up beneath my thick coat, and he had numerous layers. I wasn't majorly worried about warmth, but I started to realize that I'd been very foolish. No, perhaps I'm being harsh on myself. After all, with that man's ghastly smile floating around in my brain, it was hard to think clearly. When protecting a baby, parents can act in irrational ways. Plenty of mothers have made rasher decisions than walking home in the dark, I assured myself. Still, when I reached the tunnels that passed beneath Accrington, I started to think that it might be time to head to the main road. An Uber was a luxury I could scarcely afford, but it wasn't worth risking the safety of Milo and me. I looked at the GPS on my phone. On foot, cutting through the terrifying tunnel, I could reach home in 10 minutes, and the sheltered passage would provide warmth, I told myself. Perhaps it was worth the risk. I eyeballed the cavernous chasm before me and plunged into the gaping mouth of Accrington's gloomy underground tunnel. There were flickering lights lining the walls, but they were covered in mold. Some of them were broken, most of them were faded, and none of them provided sufficient illumination. It was such a long and dark passage that I couldn't even see a reassuring light at the tunnel's exit. There was nothing but a pit of blackness before and behind me. As I started to regret my decision and prepare to turn on my heel, a sudden clunking sound echoed from the darkness at the far end of the tunnel. Milo started to wriggle inside my coat. "Hush, baby," I tenderly pleaded. "It's okay. Mommy's going back the way she came." And then something appeared beneath the dim glow of a tunnel light that still functioned. A man. He raised a hand and waved at me. I did what I should have done long before that. I turned and sprinted back to the tunnel's entrance. I couldn't see where I was going, and I prayed that I would not stumble over anything in the dark. I clutched Milo tightly, but the sudden movement seemed to jolt him from his slumber. He began to wail uncontrollably, and it took all of my bravery not to do the same. How much for Milo? The words carried down the tunnel in a haunting echo, chasing me all the way back to the entrance. I looked at the GPS on my phone, trying to find the fastest way to the main road. Without thinking, I started to cut through the woodland that surrounded me. I know it wasn't very smart to weave between trees in the dark, especially whilst being stalked by a madman, but the footpath seemed too long and windy. The shortcut seemed like the best option. I was fixated on the goal at hand. I had to reach civilization as quickly as possible. I used the flashlight on the back of my phone to light the way, making sure I didn't run headfirst into any trees. Milo continued to cry inconsolably. "I know, baby," I breathlessly whispered as I sprinted onwards. "I know." There was a sudden whistling sound. It filled me with immense dread. It seemed to have the same effect on everything in my surroundings as birds suddenly soared from the trees in a frenzied panic. I kept pushing onwards, but I suddenly recognized the tune. "How much is that doggy in the window?" The whistling turned into humming. It was a gentle, wispy sound that hovered in the air like a bitter breeze. Eventually, the man began to sing his own demented version of the song in a fragile croon. "How much for that baby in the window?" he delicately sang. My phone's flashlight suddenly caught his face between two trees, and the man pounced upon me, swiping at my arms in a wild attempt to steal my child. He only caught my face, but those fingernails were wretched weapons. Cheeks stinging with claw marks and blood trickling down my face, I sprinted blindly through the trees, driven by primal fear. I felt that I was moments from death. It was nothing short of a miracle when I finally stumbled past the edge of the tree line and found myself standing beside a busy main road. I didn't even think about calling a friend or an Uber. I ran into moving traffic, flailed my arms, and caused two cars in opposite lanes to slam on their brakes. Obviously, the drivers were furious, but their anger quickly subsided when I explained my horrifying predicament. One of them proceeded to call 999, and he waited with me until a police vehicle arrived. The officers escorted Milo and me home. The police collected all of the information that I had on the stalker, but I had this horrible feeling that it would be a fruitless endeavor. I think he's still following me and biding his time.